Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of The Chocolate Life Live. My name is Clay Gordon. I'm your host and your moderator, and I'm also the creator of TheChocolateLife.com. Today, we're going to be taking a deep dive into production pathways, starting from Melangers, and basically asking the question, where do you go from there? It's not really a straightforward question, and there are lots of factors which play into how you might grow out of Melangers into other production methods. And we're going to cover some of what those production methods are today when we get into the heart of the episode. Before we do that, I'd like to point out, as I do at the beginning of every episode, that please go in the comments, whether you're watching on YouTube, LinkedIn, or Facebook, and just give us a quick shout out. Let us know where in the world you're connecting from, whether that's YouTube, LinkedIn, or Facebook, just where in the world you're connecting from. I'll get that up onto the screen. And of course, if you have questions or comments that you'd like to ask during the course of the hour, put them into the comments and I will put them up on screen and I will attempt to answer your questions during the course of the hour. And if I can't get them answered during the course of the hour, what I will do is I will do the research and put some information into the post on the Chocolate Life for today's live stream. And with that, what I will do is I will go and share. This is the homepage of TheChocolateLife.com right now. This is live. And I want to thank everybody who is a member of The Chocolate Life, whether a free member or a premium member, because these episodes of The Chocolate Life Live are sponsored by you. If you'd like to contribute to that, just go click on a join button. And become a member, whether it's a free member or a premium member. And then, of course, you're watching here on YouTube, go like, subscribe, share, add a comment. That will help spread the word. Also, the same thing is true of Facebook and LinkedIn. So this is the homepage of The Chocolate Life at the moment. And for every single post, live stream that I do, I create a post. And this is the post on The Chocolate Life for this. What I do is I provide a link to the YouTube, Facebook, and LinkedIn, where you can go and watch this. But then there's also an episode overview in which I explain what it is that I'm going to do over the course of the hour, and then publish links to resources that you can review prior to the starting of the episode. And I want to, right, and I have recently been posting up over on LinkedIn. This is what it looks like over on LinkedIn. And you can interact with questions and comments and everything there as well if you're on LinkedIn and want to use it there. But going back to today's post, what I want to do is I want to start off. Number one, I'm playing with a new feature, which is these toggles. These allow me to essentially hide and display content. So it's a new feature of Ghost. So the first question is, why do we start at Melangers? Right? And in part, we have to go back to the early history of the craft chocolate movement. So this is in the early 2000s and John Nancy and chocolate alchemy. And in a previous episode on influences and orthodoxy, I mentioned that I thought that John was probably one of the, if not the most influential single individuals in the history of the craft chocolate movement, because he is the one who came up with using small melangers. Right? So these are originally designed for use in Indian restaurant kitchens and home kitchens to create batters for making idli, and these would be from lentils and other forms of grains. So, that's where the use of melangers in the craft chocolate movement started. Of course, they existed for a long time. I mean, here is an antique Lehman Melanger. I saw this in the Lit Museum in Cologne, Germany in 2018. It was at least 75 years old, if not much longer. So these melangers have been around for a long, long time. And what we find is that John made the connection that these small idli grinders could be used like these big melangers could. And so why melangers? Number one, and again, I apologize, I'm going and I haven't had a chance to update the CSS to make this stuff more readable. But in any event, so number one is they can be extremely inexpensive. mean, the great thing about starting off in chocolate making is that I can go buy a tabletop grinder from Premier, from Spectra Plaza, from Cocoa Town, and I can spend, well under $500. Um, and so that's one of the reasons why people start in Melangers. If I'm going to start in a ball mill, if I'm going to start in a roll mill, if I'm going to start in a universal, I'm into tens of thousands just on the equipment, and then there's the infrastructure which is necessary to support it. So the great thing about Melangers is they can be incredibly cheap. Now after that, they're also really easy to understand how they work. I mean, it's stone grinding. We know about stone grinding of corn and other kinds of grains. If I come from India, this is a process that I'm very, very familiar with. But they're very easy to understand how they work, and you can see them. Take the top off. You can actually see them in operation, understand exactly what it is that's going on. Right? And for the purposes of many, many craft chocolate makers, one of the great advantages of working in Melangers is that I can go from like a small tabletop Premier grinder, which might hold 3 or 4 kilograms. I can go into maybe a 10 or 20 kilogram Melanger, and my recipes will fairly faithfully um, um, scale, right? I don't need to learn entirely new processes. There aren't other things that I need to figure out in order to make it work. It's the process and the recipe pretty much scales 1-to-1 from a small machine into a large machine. The things that will be different will be the time involved. That's probably the major change when it comes to a recipe. Is it something that may take, 12 hours in a small tabletop Melanger because of the relatively small volumes that are involved, might take much longer in a bigger Melanger, just because there's so much more in order that mass that needs to be moved around. And so this is one of the reasons why people like Melangers. The challenges with Melangers, right, is that they don't scale very well. So the only way to scale production easily and straightforwardly is to grow the size of the Melanger. And so I can go fairly easily from a small tabletop 2 kilo machine into roughly 80 or 90, maybe 100 kilos or thereabouts. There aren't a whole lot of Melangers that are much bigger than that, right? And the larger they get, the longer it takes for the most part to be able to finish a batch. And so it's very, very easy to understand how to do it. But if I want to double my production in Melangers, what that means is I buy a second Melanger. And then if I want to increase my production again, I buy another Melanger. And this is very, very simple and very, very straightforward. I don't need to learn anything new if that's the way I go about doing it. The challenges with that, right? These are things I'm jumping ahead when it comes to obstacles to scaling and other kinds of things like that. The challenge with this, and this is something that I think that the Mass brothers learned, is that eventually it gets, number one, really, really expensive to do this. I mean, if I'm buying let's say at the time the Mass brothers were using Cocoa Town ECGC 35s that cost, fully kitted out roughly $10,000 a piece. If I have 20 of them, then I've spent $200,000 on them. That doesn't include installation, so I need the electrical sign up for all of that. And then I need to consider the rent, the space that each one of these things requires, and that each one requires an enormous amount of labor. Or no, it's its own individual amount of labor. If I go from 1 to 2 machines, I haven't reduced the amount of labor involved. If I go from 2 to 3 machines, I haven't reduced the amount of labor involved. There's still the same amount of labor. And this becomes a really, really important thing to consider. But before I go there and jump into that consideration, what I want to do is give a quick shout out to some people. I want to say to Chef at Marsata Chocolate in Los Angeles, good morning, everybody. Good morning, Chef. I'm glad you caught in this morning. Haven't seen your name here in some while. To Gustavo Moran from Sweden, Maroon, excuse me very much. Thanks for checking in this morning. Henry Zambrano from Ecuador, saludos, back to you, good health. And Lorenzo Dache from Peckint is watching, as well as Mike King from Encore Coffee in Kansas City. Great, everybody, thanks for checking in. And so, right, with that quick shout out to people who are connecting. What I want to do is I want to go back to this notion of labor. And to do that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to show a costing workbook that I put together. Now, if you would like a copy of this costing workbook, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a link to an email address in today's post. And what you can do is you can email me and I will send you a copy of this. I want to keep track of how many people are asking me for this rather than just embedding it into the page for download. So this sheet of the workbook enables you to be able to do a better job of understanding how much a batch of chocolate is going to cost you to make. And so we start off at the upper left-hand corner here with the farm gate price of beans. And from the farm gate price of beans, you can get to the landed cost of beans. So that's the net cost delivered. In this particular case, not the landed cost, but the net cost delivered. And from there, we start working backwards. We say, here are the beans that I'm going to use for a batch. Let's say it's 10 kilos of beans. Now, after cleaning, I've taken out some percentage for flats and doubles and broken beans and everything that I consider to be not worth of, not something that I want to be in my chocolate. And so we start off at 10 kilos, we get to another amount. We have a loss factor, which is calculated, right? And then what that ends up with is a cost per kilo of clean beans, right? Then we have the weight before roasting, the weight after roasting, then we have the weight after cracking and winnowing, and what we can get to is we can get to a yield percentage. And from that yield percentage, what we can do is we can calculate the cost of nibs, right? So really, really important that we do this. One of the things that is really difficult to assess here, and this is something that I think that more people need to do as they assess, okay, I need to scale production. How am I going to scale production, right? And that is to consider the amount of labor that is involved in each one of these steps. Now, I just naively have a calculation in here that says for this batch of chocolate, I spent 2 hours, for example, and I have a burdened labor cost. So it's, if I were paying myself, even if you're not paying yourself, you should keep track of it. So my burdened labor cost is say $20 an hour, which is, minimum wage plus taxes, right? Maybe no benefits, but I have an average burdened labor cost. So I know that. So it turns out that what's going on here is that if I am a big industrial chocolate maker, or even a medium-sized industrial chocolate maker, but even if I'm a bigger chocolate maker, what it is that I have done is I have reduced the cost of labor as much as I possibly can, right? So I've done that by the choices of equipment that I've made. So, what machinery am I going to use to take the chocolate from take the raw cocoa beans and transforms them into chocolate? And then how am I going to move the elements from one part of the process to another? So the beans come into my factory, they need to be cleaned. How do they get from pallets of beans in sack to where they are cleaned? And then once they are cleaned, how do I move them from there into the roaster? And once I get done roasting with them, how do I get them into the cracker and winnower? So it turns out that materials handling, right, is on automated materials handling, and is one of the keys to reducing the amount of labor that's involved, right? And this is what is done in continuous processing lines and bigger processing lines. What they've done is they've reduced the cost of labor, right? When you reduce the cost of labor as far as you possibly can, then it is the cost of ingredients that become really, really important. But as a craft chocolate maker, until you've done that, until you've reduced the cost of labor as much as you possibly can, it turns out that you can buy much more expensive beans, right, and not see a significant impact in the cost of the finished chocolate. There's actually the ability to calculate that in one of the sheets in this workbook, right? So I've added that in. And so I wanted to say to Natalia Evangelista, who's watching from LinkedIn, Natalia, after we get done with this episode, what I am going to do is I'm going to put an update on the post for the Chocolate Life. So I'm going to put an update on this post, which you can see. It's going to be near the top, somewhere up here. And it's going to say, if you want a copy of the workbook, click on this to send me an email. So send me an email and I will send it back to you. All right. So that's how, Natalia, you're going to be able to get at this workbook. So I hope you understand that that's what it is that I'm going to be doing. All right. So that's what this worksheet accomplishes within the context of this workbook. Right. You can figure out how much labor contributes to the finished cost. But it requires that you actually go and keep track of how much time you're spending and how much value how much value you assign to each hour of labor. So you have to do that, and that's not a part of this. It's not my job to do this. This is just a framework from which you can consider what it is that you need to be able to keep track of. That's what this is for. Right. So when we think about moving out of Melangers, the great thing about Melangers, again, you can start off really cheaply. They're really easy to understand how they use, right? And it's relatively easy to move up from a very small machine to much larger machines, right? There's not much change to recipes. And what you can do is what changes is the amount of time involved. But why? So why would I stay in Melangers? Right? And why would I even start out with Melangers? And there are a couple of reasons why. One of which is there is a feeling in the craft chocolate industry that stone on stone grinding is more authentic, right? And because it's more authentic, not only is it the right way to do it, but is the only way to do it. Now, whether you agree with that or you don't agree with that, there is an ethos around chocolate making, craft chocolate making, which is centered around this notion of authenticity. I don't buy it, right? But there is personally, I don't buy it. But that's one thing. It's it's almost like you're either a Windows person or you're a Mac person. There's this almost almost I hesitate the word, it's quasi-religious in terms of your feeling. Yes, it's part of the identity of the company. It was certainly part of the identity of the Mass Brothers, right? What they did is they were working in these small batch machines and they dedicated individual machines to individual chocolates, and it became part of the identity that they built around how they marketed themselves as chocolate makers. And so it would be perhaps fair to state that if the Mass Brothers went from small Melangers to large Universals, that they would no longer be the Mass Brothers, because that's the way they had always presented themselves. So we do need to think about some of what are some of the barriers to changing production pathways. Number one, why would I go from a Melanger to a Universal, or why would I go from a Melanger to a ball mill, right? Or why would I go from a Melanger to some other method of production, right? One of the reasons is that this whole ethos of what is considered to be truly craft, and if you move to metal on metal, you're no longer a craft chocolate maker. I don't buy that argument. I don't believe that's where the definition of craft hangs out, right? But another thing we need to consider is that if I move from one method of chocolate making to another method of chocolate making, then what happens is necessarily my recipes have to change, right? So for example, you may be using a bean with a low fat content, so under 50%. And by the way, legally, you can't call it chocolate if the liquor contains less than 50% fat. It's just the way the rules are written. That might work very, very well in a Melanger. You might have trouble processing that easily in a ball mill. You may find that you need to add some cocoa butter in order to fluidize everything and get it to work. You may or may not. It depends upon what the fat level of the cocoa bean is and the recipe and all sorts of other things like that. But you may find that the recipes are not directly transferable. You need to change it. And then, you are used to, Melangers are not conches. People call them conches. That's wrong. They're refiners. They can be used as universals, and so you can conch in them, but they are generally incredibly inefficient when it comes to conching. I may be able to get to the texture that I'm looking for example, in 24 hours, but it may take an additional 48 hours in order to be able to do the flavor development that I want to do. And so as you're moving from changing from one pathway to another pathway, most ball mills, because they work so quickly and because they have a tendency not to be able to bubble air through the mixture, there are some ball mills that do that. You need to actually have a separate conch in order to be able to do the flavor development that you want to do. So you're changing production pathways, and now all of a sudden you have some machinery that is going to change the way you do things. And so your recipes are no longer, and by the recipe, I mean the method. How long am I do this? How long am I do that? How long do that? So that's part of the recipe. And generally, they're not generally transferable. And those are two of the main barriers to changing the production pathways, in addition to costs. I mean, I can buy a 40-pound, 20-kilo Melanger, for well under $10,000, and it may be even half that price depending upon who you buy it from and where you buy it. I mean, they're very inexpensive. They're also incredibly energy inefficient, and so one of them may not be energy efficient, but 10 of them are energy inefficient. And so there's a tendency to take a look just at CapEx, what does it cost me today, not to look at total cost of ownership, right? And that's something that needs to be taken a look at. What is the total cost of ownership of a piece of equipment? So let's go take a look. One of the sheets in my workbook, let me scroll over here, is a machine comparison. I'm not gonna look at this very closely, or I could zoom in on it. But for example, here we have, a Melanger wet grinder comparison. And so I'm looking at what the batch capacity is, what the price is, what the price per kilogram per batch capacity is. I can then go and figure out how many machines I need in order to be able to figure out how to produce a certain amount of chocolate per year. So for example, if I have a 4-kilo batch capacity machine that costs me, $115 per kilo capacity. If I'm running one machine, it takes me 1 day to finish a machine. To do one batch, I'm running it 6 days a week. You get the idea. I can produce with this machine at no more than 960 kilos of chocolate from this one machine per year. Just very, very simple calculation to do, right? And you have to go do this. You can now say, okay, what happens when I go to a 20-kilo machine, what the batch capacity is. You can now move out of Melangers into universals, into ball mills. This becomes a way to do a comparison of the capital expenditure, which is required, and then to get an idea about how much you can produce in a given year, and then think about what are some other costs which are not CapEx, which are not the purchase price. So what you may want to do, you can see here, I mean, it says this is naive. It doesn't include labor, rent, and no consideration for depreciation, and no consideration of what the utilities cost is going to be. How much is it going to take to power the machine via electricity, and no consideration of air conditioning load, right? So if I'm going to put a lot more heat into a space, I need a bigger air conditioner, maybe. And so what does it cost to power that air conditioning? If there is, it turns out, a place where I've started some of these calculations. So this is another sheet in the workbook. So you have the machine cost, the depreciation schedule, right? So if you do that, if you have a $10,000 machine, which you put together on a 3-year depreciation schedule, it costs you 38 cents per hour. If it says, okay, it occupies 16 square feet, which is 1.6 square meters, más o menos. If your rent is $12 a square foot a year, here's how much your rent is per hour. You've got the cost of energy, in this case, per kilowatt hour. You need this amount of units per hour. What you can do is you can figure out adding labor in, you can figure out how much it costs you to just keep the machine sitting there idly doing nothing, and then how much is the cost as you're actually using it, right? And this gives you, so, in this particular case, again, it's not very, these are just numbers I picked out of the air. In order to do this, what you get is you might find that it costs you $52.74 per batch, right, to run this particular machine when you consider rent and air conditioning and labor. Just that it, right? So if you're going to want to go and you're going to move from one production methodology to another production methodology, you should figure out what the total cost of ownership is, not just the CapEx for what it is that's going on. And so again, these are naive calculations. I use these with my consulting clients to help drill in on specifics of what it is that they're doing, right? To say, yeah, it may look like the CapEx, this is $90,000 as opposed to this is $20,000. But when it comes to the amount of chocolate that can be produced per year, oh my gosh, maybe the price difference is worth it. Okay, we need to go take a look at it, in which case, how do I go about and finance the upfront purchase price for what it is that's going on? So these, again, these numbers in here were just a play to make sure that the formulas worked properly. They're not complete ideas. They're not complete by any stretch of the imagination. It's designed for people to go and take these and think about their own business and to be able to put them in place. All right, so I just want to be really, really clear what these things do and what it is that they don't do, right? So having said that, what are some of the obstacles to scaling, right? So I talked about this right up front, right? That at some point there is a tipping point where once I have reduced the cost of labor below a certain point, there are no real ways to increase cost efficiency, so to reduce the cost, right, than to make sure my ingredients costs are as low as possible. And this is, in fact, one of the factors in the marketplace that lead to the big chocolate companies doing everything they can to make sure the cost of cocoa is as low as it possibly can be. They've got their labor costs done. They've got all of their understanding about how much it takes to run their machinery on how much contribution of the cost of running the plant can be attributed to this bar or this case of bars. They understand this really, really well, right? And so if there is a change in the cost of energy or if there's a change in anything else, they're able to anticipate it and understand what it is that's going on. So one of the obstacles to scaling is not understanding this, right? You don't understand at what point it makes sense to invest in labor-saving devices, right? Because it is the cost of labor that's keeping your costs high. So part of the ethos, and this is something we've discussed on many occasions on Chocolate Life Live and on Clubhouse before then, and a number of posts on the Chocolate Life, is this notion of quality. There are people who equate spending a lot of time doing tedious, boring things with quality. And I think the most tedious, boring things that people spend a lot of time doing are sorting, right? So we are going to hand inspect every single bean, right? And because we hand inspect every single bean, what that means is that our product is necessarily higher quality. And I have to say the answer to that is no. The only direct correlation is that the costs increase. That's the only thing. The more time you spend with something, the more expensive it is to produce. That's the only direct correlation. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's a higher quality, right? But if you don't understand the impact of how much it's actually costing you to perform this step, then you don't understand that at some point, it may make sense to actually invest in a small piece of machinery, which will reduce the cost of this particular step. And that if you can recover the cost in under a year, that's great. Anytime you can do an ROI calculation that says I can entirely recoup my cost of buying that machine in under a year, it makes sense to go and buy it immediately, because it is in the cost of labor that I can it significantly reduce my cost of manufacturing. So having that, the other place that people don't really consider. So if I'm hand inspecting beans, or the company that says we hand peel every raw bean, right? And the reason why we're doing it is because we want to reduce to an absolute minimum the amount of lead that might be in the cocoa beans. I get it. I understand that. Maybe it's virtuous. Maybe it's not. I'd like to see the test on the same beans that says, here's the actual cadmium level of hand sorting and hand peeling, as opposed to just mechanically, just cracking and winnowing conventionally, right? But materials handling is where a lot of time is spent. I need to get the beans out of the bag to the sorting table. After I get done sorting, I need to get them from the sorting table to the roaster. I need to get them from the roaster to the cracker and winnower. I need to get them from the nibs from the cracker winnower to the Melanger or to whatever. It is this hand movement of things from step A to step B to step B to step C, right? That involves a lot of time, and time is money in this particular case. And so, for example, if you were to go and take a look at a ball mill system from a company like Packint, one of the things that you'll find is that some aspects of this materials handling have been taken care of you. So you're going to pump the chocolate from the ball mill into the conch. You're going to pump the chocolate from the conch into a holding tank. You're not going to move it by hand. Whereas if you're working with Melangers, there's no materials handling that's being done, right? There's just none, right? And so you need to consider what that means, right, in terms of labor costs. And this is one of the obstacles to scaling. Equipment on the surface of it has a tendency to seem expensive if you don't have a real solid understanding of what your cost structure is. You don't know what the tipping point is. When does it make sense? At this amount of volume, it makes sense to switch from this method of doing something to some other method of doing something, right? So this is why this is all really important as I'm doing it. I mean, and this is on top of this self-imposed blinders when it comes to, stone on stone is the only authentic way to do it. And if we're not doing it stone on stone, then it's not really craft. I mean, that's not what the definition of craft is, right? I am firmly committed to the idea that we need to divorce the idea of what craft means away from the equipment that we use. And I've said it before, I think it's attitude. You're an industrial chocolate maker when your primary concern is around consistency because your customers demand it. They demand the same flavor, they demand the same rheology, they demand the same pH. What you're doing when you start a batch of chocolate is you know what the finished chocolate is going to look like and taste like. You know exactly how it's going to flow, you know exactly what the pH is, you know exactly what the flavor. You start off with the end goal in mind, and everything that you do, right, is to get to that end goal. That's what makes you an industrial chocolate or a not craft chocolate maker, right? A craft chocolate maker, on the other hand, says, how do I maximize the flavor potential of the beans that I have in front of me, right? Now, I don't believe that this means that what you can do is you can say, well, every single batch is an opportunity for new creative expression. That's not the way it works, or that's not the way it should work, in my opinion, right? If you want to call yourself a competent craft chocolate maker, if somebody asks you to make one chocolate from a metric ton of cocoa beans, right, and all you have is 100-kilo Melanger, right, then you should be able to produce, right, you should be able to transform that 100 kilos or that metric ton of cocoa beans into chocolate such that from beginning to end, the chocolate all tastes the same. Doesn't mean you're industrial. I have this lot of beans, and my goal is to create chocolate. If you can't create chocolate that tastes the same, right, within that metric ton, I think you have learning that you need to do in order to be able to call yourself a competent craft chocolate maker. Now, you don't have to be able to, you don't have to do that on a batch by batch basis. You can say that every single batch is an opportunity for creative expression. However, if what we want to do is we want to elevate chocolate to the notion of, for example, vintaged wines, I mean, I don't go to the liquor store expecting that wines from different barrels in the same year is going to taste different. And so that I might pick a bottle from a case, right, from one barrel, and then 2 weeks later come in and pick a bottle from a case from another barrel, and they might taste very different, even though they're from the same vineyard in the same harvest year, right? We don't expect that, and if that happened, you know, the winemaker would be incompetent, right, and their reputation would sag, right, would be severely tarnished, right? The goal should be, in my opinion, if you want to call yourself a competent craft chocolate maker, is that from within any contiguous lot of beans that you have, all of these beans from this harvest, from this location, right, that what you do is from the first bag to the last bag that you can produce chocolate which tastes the same, right? And we vintage that. We say, here is the harvest year, and here's what we're doing, and everybody should expect. If I go to a different harvest year, it can taste different. If I go to a different location, it can taste different. But within one harvest year from beans, you should be able to do it, I believe, right? If you want to call yourself a competent craft chocolate maker. Now, I've run into the problem where I have pulled off a shelf. For some reason, the retailer shelved two different batches of what was on the label the same chocolate, right? And so I got to the destination where I was doing the tasting, realized that I had two different batches, and the two different batches tasted nothing alike, right? Where I needed to change at the last minute what I was planning to, use these as a demonstration for. But it's really, really important. If your customers say, okay, here's the 2017 harvest, and they buy it one time and they like it, they come back a second time, they like it, they come back a third time and it's radically different, and they never buy it again. Why? Right? What's the point? There's nothing wrong, right, with consistency. And as a matter of fact, you should be able to do it if asked. And if you can't do it if asked, I think you need to work on your technique and your understanding of your technique. Right. So this has to do with self-imposed blinders and authenticity and quality. So every batch is on its own, right? And that, which I think is a mistake. People who've taken any of my classes will know I say blending is your friend. Take all the bags from the same harvest and blend the bags, mix the bags together. So if there are bag-to-bag differences, they're ironed out. When you do roast, if you're doing 4 or 5 roasts to fill up your Melanger, you're going to blend the roast together, but you want to make sure that, that's what you do. When you come out of the Melanger a Melanger, right, what you can do is you can take the contents of 3 or 4 different Melangers and call them one batch and mix them together. The only thing that has changed is what your definition of a batch is, right? And by doing this blending, very, very simple blending, it's the same. It's not blending vintages, it's not blending origins, it's not blending anything else. It's just, okay, right, we're just doing this to make sure we have a more consistent product because it's what our customers want, right? So, this notion that the single batch has primacy, that stone on stone has primacy, no, get over it, right? And this is all factored into, like, you don't know what it actually cost you to produce this stuff, right? Because you're not taking into account all of the factors, right? And these are the obstacles to understanding how to scale, right? So at this point, what you can do is you can say, here is what I need to produce. So here's the demand that I have. What is going to be the most cost-effective way to meet that demand, right? And it's at this point that what you're doing is you're saying, all right, do I need to move out of Melangers, number one, in the first place, right? So perhaps not. So maybe what you can do, right, is you can buy a pre-grinder. And if you bought a pre-grinder and you can refine the sugar into the pre-grinder, into the liquor before you put it into the melanger, you can cut the amount of time that you're in the melanger. Yay, right? So that reduces the amount of time that it takes to produce a batch, right? Another thing that you might do is you might say, I am going to introduce a stream of warm air over the top of the chocolate as it's being refined in the melanger, so that what I can do is I can hasten the evaporation of the volatile components I don't want out of it. So I can hasten the flavor development process of conching in the melanger, right? So you need to be careful about how this is done, but that would be one way to do it. So I could get a pre-grinder. I could find a way to increase the speed of flavor development in the melanger. And so what that might do is it might go, oh, rather than it taking 3 days to do something, it now takes 2 days to do something. I've just got 50% more capacity by doing that, right? So rather than taking 6 days to do 2 batches, I could do 3 batches in that same 6 days. So I've gone from 2 batches to 3 batches, or 50% increase, just by investing that little bit. Another way to do that would be to say, you know what, I'm actually going to buy a purpose-built conch. And so what the purpose-built conch will do is it will say, rather than it taking 48 hours to do the conching, I can get that conching done in 2 to 3 hours tops, right? I still need to manually move the chocolate from the melanger into the conch, right? But, right, I can now take a process that that would normally take me 3 days, and I can do 1 day in the refiner. And as long as the conching period takes less than 2 days, or less than the time it takes to do the refining, less than 24 hours, I am good to go, right? So I can now, because I've separated out the conching phase from the refining phase, what I can do is, rather than doing 1 batch every 3 days, I can now do 3 batches every 3 days. And if the little conch is also a melting tank, then there are all sorts of other ways you might use that. For example, you could use the conch as a melting tank in front of your tempering machine. So thinking about what other machines I might be able to use is a really interesting idea. So for example, maybe what you could do is you could go from a pre-grinder, liquor and sugar, get them mixed together, and run through a 3-roll mill. If I run that through a 3-roll mill a couple of times, what I can do is I can get the particle size down to exactly what I want, right, or close enough. I can throw it into the melanger, and maybe it's only 4 or 5 hours in the melanger before I get the texture that I'm looking for. Because what I need to do is I need to throw some shear in there and get the particle clumps broken up, and I need to get everything covered in the cocoa butter, right? And the great thing about it is, if you have a 3-roll mill and you want to do nut pastes, you've got a great thing to do nut pastes. And you can change the order in which you do things. You could take it out of the pre-grinder into the melanger into the 3-roll mill before you put it into the conch, or you could take it out of the pre-grinder into the conch, so you've got conch liquor. So when you, it's like, those are ways to take a single melanger and increase the capacity of the melanger significantly. You still have the materials handling issue. Hands down, you still have the materials handling issue, right? You haven't solved that, but what you've done is you have increased the productivity, and you've given yourself a lot of different ways to attack the problem of making chocolate. If all you have is a hammer, right, and by the hammer I mean the melanger, if all you have is the melanger, then you have only one tool and you have only one approach to making chocolate. And so, right, that's where we're going to go with that aspect of things. But the question becomes, if I want to move out, I'm at a point where, you know what, listen, I can no longer be in a melanger. What I need to do is I need to move to another method of production, and I'm prepared to bite the bullet and do whatever it costs in order to, and do whatever it takes, takes and costs in order to make that. The question becomes, if I'm doing a metal on metal, do I want to go with a ball mill, and do I want to go with a melanger or a universal? And there are economic arguments to be made on both sides of these things. I personally believe that both of these kinds of machines can be used to make incredibly good chocolate. I don't think you need to sacrifice anything when it comes to texture or anything else when it comes to moving from one, moving from choosing one particular approach, a ball mill, over a universal. One thing that you may want to consider here, right? And I know people who've gone from Melangers into ball mills. So using the Melangers as a pre-refiner, they had an old Lehmann style Melanger, and they went from the Lehmann Melanger into a ball mill. So they took the nibs, they refined them into liquor. So because you have to fluidize what you're putting into a ball mill, right? It's very, very difficult, to the point of being impossible to work straight from nibs into a ball mill unless you throw in a lot of cocoa butter at the very beginning of the process. And even then, right, it depends on the ball mill. So you know what? So you want to consider that. One of the challenges at that point in terms of choosing one over the other might be this materials handling issue and the speed of production. So, for example, you would never use a ball mill on its own. Never. I do know people who use ball mills on their own, but what they tend to do is they tend to use extended aging times, right, in order for the chemicals in the chocolate to equilibrate and for things to settle down, right? But most of the time, you're going to go from a ball mill into some form of conche, right? And so what that means is you can perhaps do all the texture development you want to do, so all the refining that you want to do, in a matter of less than a couple of hours, typically, in the ball mill. And then you can pump it from the ball mill into the conche, and the conche is going to do its job in less time, right? Or certainly about the same time. And so what you can do is, if you have pumps moving things from one stage to another, you can work pretty much continuously. Or what you might do is you might have a ball mill of, let's say, 100 or a 100 liter capacity and a conche of a 500 liter capacity. And so what you do is you'd run 4 or 5 batches in the ball mill and pump all of those batches into the conche, and then you conche multiple batches at the same time. And there are advantages of that when it comes to consistency. Not a bad idea, right? To do that. With a universal, what happens is the machine is designed to be able to do the pre-grinding, refining, and conching, right? Right, in the same machine, what's called universals, right? And they're relatively easy to understand how it works, but they, for the most part, will take longer than a ball mill, right? And so you're going to want a larger capacity universal, right, if you want to be able to keep to the same production quantity. So the amount of time it takes to refine the chocolate is dependent upon the pressure that is applied to the blades, which scrape on the inside of the machine. So the tighter the pressure, the higher the pressure, the faster the refining process goes. What doesn't change is the amount of time it takes to actually do the flavor development component of the conching. That's dependent upon the temperature internally and the airflow within the machine. So I've seen many people put fans, a push fan and a pull fan, on the vents in their universals, so they're constantly pushing air or pulling air through the mass, and that will speed the conching time, so reduce the amount of time it takes to conch. There's an interesting question there, and I just got it. What we have to consider is that the refining time, if I get looser on the Melanger or looser on the universal, is going to be dependent upon the sugar that's being used and how much sugar is in the recipe. Generally, the more sugar there is, the longer it's going to take. The liquor is going to refine very, very quickly, right? But what I can do is I can play with the tension. So what I can do is I can say, I want it to take 24 hours. Therefore, which says that if I miss, right, this 24-hour period by 5 or 10 minutes either side, it's not huge. If I want to run it for very, very loose for 3 days because I want the conching to happen at a particular speed, then then what's going to happen is that if I miss it by a couple of minutes either side, or even an hour or so either side, chances are there's not going to be a huge difference. in it. One of the challenges that I face, and I've got a consulting client right now that I think is facing this problem, is that if you're not really careful in a ball mill, it's really easy to over refine. And so if you're not really precise in terms of your timing, you can quickly go from, like 15 micron center of particle distribution with a very, very tight curve to something which is, more towards 12 or lower with lots of much smaller particles. And when that happens, the texture gets mucked up, the ability to temper the chocolate changes, and it really is a challenge. So when it comes to the difference between ball mills and universals, that's something to consider, right? How long do I want my batches to run? Maybe ball mills are easier to clean than universals. There's still flushing in cocoa butter that is required. As a matter of fact, over on Craft Chocolate TV with Dylan Butterbaugh, who I believe owns a pack-in line, there is a discussion of what it takes for them to clean. They don't clean; they actually just flush it out with cocoa butter. What it takes to go from one to another, and that's something that you need to factor in, right, to the cost of. So what is the cost of the cocoa butter? How much time does it take in hours? What is the cost of that time? And we need to factor that into the batch and then eventually into every bar. And if there's nothing else that we talk about that's the thing I think y'all need to really pay close attention to when it comes to scaling up production. Do I want to stay in Melangers? Right? Do I want to move from Melanger to another production pathway? Right. What does that do? Again, a little came in, and my attention was done. So number one from Gustavo Maroon, who's connecting from Sweden, and I hope I got it. Maroon. I hope I got the pronunciation correct. Do you think that by using the ball mill or 3-roll refiner will change the taste of the chocolate if I go from a Melanger to a ball mill or a roll mill? So the answer to that question is yes, unless. So if I just go from a Melanger into a ball mill, right? One of the challenges that I need to address, one of the differences that I need to address is conching, right? And so if what it is that I'm looking to do is I'm looking to so assuming that the beans are the same and the roasting is the same, right? So let's just take those. And if I'm using added cocoa butter, that if the cocoa butter is the same. So I'm assuming that those things are the same. When I move from a Melanger into a ball mill, all right, or a roll mill, whether it's a 3-roll mill or a 5-roll mill, what I need to do is I need to consider the conching. And what I would do is I would play with the time and the temperature in the conching to replicate the time and the temperature, the flavor result coming out of the Melanger. So it can be done. And in my experience, this is one of the things that can take time in transferring a recipe is if I go, for example, from a small Bmore roaster and I decide that what I want to do is I want to go from that little Bmore roaster into like a combi oven roaster. I mean, I need to spend a fair amount of time playing with my roast profiles because time and temperature are not going to translate one-to-one, right? So that's an aspect of scaling. But what you may notice, right, when you go from a Melanger into a ball mill, is that there will be a small textural difference. As a matter of fact, I went to the Douwesdiener factory in Zaandam outside of Amsterdam, and they handed me 2 chocolates which were identical recipes, one which had been done in a ball mill, and one which had been done from a nibs into a 3-roll mill into a 5-roll mill into a conche, and then the other one was from a ball mill into a conche. And the recipes, in terms of ingredients, were all the same. There is technically a texture difference, right? And a lot of it has to do with the roll mill. You might get to a certain particle size, but you only know the particle size in the thickness of the gap between the rollers. You don't know what the particle size is in the horizontal dimension, which is parallel to the plane of the rollers. And so when you run it through a ball mill, particle size, depending upon what ball mill you're using, is dependent on the gaps, the minimum gap, and the difference, and the not just the minimum gap, but the distribution of gaps between the steel balls. And so there is a difference in texture. Now, the average person probably wouldn't be able to detect that texture unless they were paying close attention to it. But, and I was handed these two things, and I would not have been able to tell you which one was which, or necessarily that they were different, until somebody pointed out to me what was going on with them. All right. So I think, Gustavo, that you can produce essentially identical chocolate, but you need to have a good technical understanding of all the variables of the process in order to be able to understand. And Lorenzo, I know you're listening. If my understanding of this is correct, that you need to play with the conching phase, that you follow the ball mill or the roll refiner with. You need to play with the conching in order to make sure that you can get to the same flavor results. And you're going to do that in a much shorter period of time than you would if you did it in a Melanger, which is one of the reasons why we're doing this, right? Lorenzo, great, thanks for the clarification. The consideration about refining time is right, but some ball mills have timers to stop the refining at a given time. So yes, if you are in fact looking at a ball mill refiner, what you might want to make sure is that there is in fact a timer on it, so that once you have in fact determined that this is the amount of time you need to run the refiner to get to the particles, the center of particle size, and then the particle size distribution that you're looking for, that what you want to do is you want to stop the circulation, right, of the refining motion of it. You still may want to pump the chocolate through. The heaters are going to be there to make sure that the chocolate doesn't solidify, but you can stop it at any given time. And as a matter of fact, I'm guessing, Lorenzo, if I want to spend the money, that what I can do is at the moment the refining is done, what I can do is I can just pump it automatically over to the conch. I mean, there's no reason why that technically can't be done. It's just a matter of, paying the money to have the electronics and the mechanics, the motors and gears and everything which are necessary, and pumps necessary to make that happen. But these are the things that you do want to know and you do want to consider. And when you're working with a consultant and you're working with a manufacturer, these are the kinds of questions you're going to want to make sure that you understand. So we're almost at the end of the hour. I mean, when I started this, I didn't know that, how long it was going to take. What I want to do is I want to talk to this this last point here, right? Right, which is one of the things I've noticed in the last 20 years is that there's actually been no new equipment, right? Let me put this back. All of the, I think, innovation in thing has been around how do I do exactly what it is that I'm doing now in less time? So I may, for example, I may go from a particular kind of conch into what's called a thin film conch. And so I've done some innovation around conching, and I now have this thing called a thin film conch, which can work incredibly rapidly, right? Right. But when I think about it, we've got Melangers, we've got roll mills, we've got ball mills, and we have universals. And these have been around for a long time, right? And I haven't seen much new, anything new, really. I mean, we've done bigger capacity, all these machines. There's a company called Netch, and one of the things they've done is they've packed a ball mill into a tube and you pump things through. And so, yeah, that's an innovation on a ball mill rather than an open cylinder where you just move things. But there hasn't been really anything new when it comes to the basic pathways. You might say, hey, yeah, Kazama is doing their chevron pattern on their grinding wheels. I haven't seen any independent research that says this is effective as they claim it is. I would like to see that if anybody's done it, right? But there's not a whole lot of innovation. We haven't come to a new way of doing the refining of chocolate. And there may not be another way to do it. I don't know the answer to that question. There may not be another way to do it, but I haven't seen any indications that actually people are doing their research on it. But I think that more fundamentally, the problem is there appears to be no interest among the manufacturers in innovating around small scale materials handling. There is no reason in this day and age why you should be standing over your 80-kilo Melanger and pouring nibs in or pouring sugar in by hand, right? Why is there not a small, inexpensive feeding mechanism, which is scaled to the size of the Melanger in terms of price? So that what you can do is you can just say, here's all the stuff that I need. I can push a button and it'll just feed, and I don't have to worry about the machine jamming, right? Why not? Right? Why do small mold vibrators cost $700? There's no reason, right? There is a reason, right? And the reason why is if I'm going to be a manufacturer, what I need to be able to do is I need to be able to sell the product at a price which is going to cover the cost of R&D, manufacturing, and selling it. And that's one of the reasons why I believe that there are no small, inexpensive vibrating tables. Yeah, people go and get dentist office vibrators, but I did purpose built for working in chocolate. They don't exist. There are no small scale feeders, and I mean, people can work with little vibratory feeder mechanisms and do the so you can DIY it. But in terms of there being something which can be done, they just don't exist. And I believe that the reason why is that there's not enough profit in it for the manufacturers to make these machines. There's no reason why a pre-grinder, there's no reason, I mean, there's really no reason why a pre-grinder that will do 10 kilos an hour of converting nibs into liquor costs 5,000 euros or 6,000 euros or 7,000 euros, right? There should be alternatives, especially for the smaller craft chocolate makers, in order to be able to get this done. Roll mills are really, really different. I mean, you need to get the precision in terms of the gap being perfectly parallel from one end to the other, and you need to make sure that the cistone themselves are ground to a precision which is much higher than you need in a Melanger. So we do need to, whether you're working with steel wheels or stone wheels, there's a degree of precision which is much higher necessarily because of the way the process works. Right. So we're not going to see I don't think we're going to see a 3-roll mill, which is going to, be under the, the €5,000 price point, just because of the precision that needs to be maintained on the machine. Right. But, why is there no inexpensive, right, bean cleaner? Right. Now, there are some really inexpensive Chinese, I mean, 3,500 by the time they're landed here in the US, inexpensive bean cleaners. Now, what they will do is they will get rid of doubles. They will get rid of most flats. They will get rid of any debris through vibration and through air. So they won't do is the integrity of this bean. So is there, has the germ fallen out and there's a hole in the shell? They won't get you to that level. Right? But they can do the vast majority of the cleaning which is necessary in order to get done, so that you're not going to run the risk of something catching on fire. Right? So a string from a bag or some bit of vegetal matter that's mated in it, there's not going to be any ferrous metal in it. The bigger stones, they're not going to be there. So I can automate all that, and I should be able to put, if I can get a machine from China into the United States for $3,000, I don't know why there hasn't been any innovation around doing that small stuff. And it turns out that if you're a craft chocolate maker and you are complaining about how long it's taking you to clean your beans, then a small bean cleaner, right, is something that you should consider. I mean, it's really, really valuable. It will get rid of 80% of your headache. And as something, if I've got it, how many hours time saving, right, over the course of the year is it going to, I don't need many hours in order for this thing to pay for itself. So really, really important. So if you're a mechanical engineer, you're an electrical engineer, somebody who's a mechanical engineer or an electrical engineer is interested in working on any of these topics in terms of very, very small scale machinery. And what we might do is we might DIY and open source some plans that we can distribute to people to get this done, then I'm interested in speaking with you. Now, I do have to say that one bit of innovation, which I really, really like, is Daniel Fairbanks at Fairbank Engineering, who's done some really, really good work on depositing hits to be able to increase the accuracy, not only mold cavity to cavity, but from edge to edge across the head. That's a place where innovation was sorely needed, and the makers that went to him. So Katie and Josiah Chukesset Chocolate and others went and had Daniel do that work. I think that's been a great bit of innovation. Another place where I think there needs to be innovation is, why after all this time do guillotines to do cut tests cost €1,000 a piece? I mean, I don't understand why they cost that much. There should be a way in this day and age to make a guillotine which costs significantly less than that. Get them in the hands of farmers, get them in the hands of chocolate makers, right? Because not all chocolate makers have decided they want to spend €1,000 plus on a guillotine. Yeah, that's from Melangers to what on this episode of the Chocolate Life Live. Thanks everybody for joining me here today. You can go to the Chocolate Life. This is the homepage right now. I'm logged in, so it says account here for me. If you're not logged in, you're not a member, it will say join. This episode of the Chocolate Life Live has been sponsored by the members, so click join. Whether it's a free account or a premium account, I know that everybody has lots of calls on their spare change, their discretionary spending. But if you find it at all useful in what it is that I have been doing here, then please join and support what we're doing. And of course, if you're watching on YouTube, LinkedIn, or Facebook, smash the like, smash the subscribe to the channel on YouTube, share this with others. And it's really, really important to note that if you are a member of the Chocolate Life, at the bottom of every single post is the opportunity to start and participate in a discussion. But you need to be a member in order to do this. So you can be a free member, that doesn't matter. But if you want to be able to follow on in what it is that we're doing, ask questions, and continue the conversation, we can do it here on every single one of the posts of the Chocolate Life Live. And just a quick note, there is a calendar which I publish, and this calendar has links to every single one of the live streams that I've done. And actually in November, it'll be 2 years. So you can go there and you can go take a look at everything that I've done. And with that, I want to say thank you very much to everyone. I will be back a week from today, next Friday. So in August, I'm taking Tuesdays off. I'll be back next week. We can see from the calendar that next Friday's post is looking at the world through chocolate-covered glasses. So it's a fun topic for me. It's just the way I look at the world. I'm going to be doing a class next Thursday for 23 small children. And I thought it would be fun to think about this topic as I'm getting ready to give a class to 23 small children. So small children, I think under the age of 14, but between the ages of 8 and 14. We're going to be talking about, where chocolate comes, where cocoa comes, how chocolate is made, all that kind of stuff. And so I'm going to do that. And then the following Friday, I'm doing a review. I'm going to be doing an Arizona whiskey and Arizona chocolate tasting at a club here in Prescott, and we're gonna follow up with that. So I'm looking forward to it, and all of those things. And with that, I want to thank everybody who's watched at any point, started from the beginning, went through all the end. Everybody who commented. Thank you very much, Lorenzo, for your contributions here today. And I don't know if you're a member, go to the Chocolate Life, become a member, and put a comment on that page. And so when other people comment on it, you will get a notification of it. And we can continue the conversation there. And with that, everybody, I just want to say thank you very much and remind you, if you're working with chocolate and you are not having fun, I think you're doing it wrong.